飞鸽制作，梅尔巴，传记，作者艾格尼斯 ·G. 墨菲。
Melba. Chapter 1. Melba's father and mother were both of Scottish birth and descent, and came from Forfarshire. David Mitchell, simple and strong, upright and resolute, and his wife, Isabella Ann Dow, gentle and sensitive, but full of courage and cheerful philosophy. Given favorable conditions, they would both have been persons of account in any community. Mr. Mitchell has in turn directed his energies to building, contracting, squatting, and wine growing, and in all he has reaped a liberal harvest of success. On 2 of his properties he recently discovered a soil suitable for the manufacture of a particular kind of cement, with which he claims that entirely fireproof buildings, including staircases and ceilings, can be constructed speedily and cheaply without the temporary iron mold by which Edison aims at popularizing cement-made houses. It is significant that his 80 years present no barrier to his cheery embarkation on this new enterprise. Both parents were sincerely fond of music, the mother, a woman of artistic temperament and more than average culture, being an amateur of considerable accomplishment. She also used her brush effectively in the creation of pictures both on canvas and china, and played the piano, harp, and organ uncommonly well. Mr. Mitchell, too, had musical talent, but not in so full a degree as his wife, although he made good use of a bass voice of beautiful timbre, and played the violin with some skill. 2 of Mrs. Mitchell's sisters possessed voices of rare beauty and a measure of musical knowledge wholly exceptional in amateurs. They were regular visitors at Dunside, Richmond, Melbourne, where Helen Porter Mitchell, the Melba of today, was born, the 3rd child of her parents. From her infancy she was thus constantly accustomed to hear music, and her earliest recollection is of crawling under the grand piano when about 4 years of age to listen in wonder and delight to her mother's playing. In this retirement she would rest perfectly content, so long as her mother remained at the pianoforte. The father took the greatest pleasure in encouraging his little daughter's love of music, and she has often since told how, when I was quite a baby, it was my great joy to sit on my father's knee on Sunday afternoons when he used to amuse himself at the harmonium. He would blow the bellows and sing a bass accompaniment to the hymn which I picked out on the keyboard with one finger. When 6 years of age, she appeared at a school concert organized by her aunts in Richmond, Melbourne. At this entertainment she sang Shells of Ocean with such effect that the audience asked for an encore, and the child, on her reappearance, created a still better impression by her singing of Comin' Through the Rye, in which her grandmother had taught her the Scottish accent. The applause of that delighted company was her first taste of pub enthusiasm, and her joy was without bounds. On returning home it was with difficulty she could be induced to sleep, and next morning she was up with the lark in order to talk over the wonderful concert. Melba as a little girl at the earliest opportunity she hurried to her favorite playmate, who lived in the same street, and breathlessly waited for some reference to the entertainment of the evening before, but the little comrade was adamant and ignored the whole subject. After many indirect attempts to introduce it, Nellie at length found herself unable to wait longer, and exclaimed excitedly, "But the concert, the concert! I sang last night, and was encored," and she looked with eagerness in the face of her friend, who answered witheringly, "Yes, and, Nellie Mitchell, I saw your garter." Miss Mitchell had been particularly pleased with her neat attire, and this unexpected shaft, coming in place of the looked-for compliment, in an instant blotted out the memory of the intoxicating encore, and drew the little singer from the seventh heaven of her brief delight to the limbo of unkind disillusion. Another story tells how, at the age of 8 or 9, she crept downstairs one night long after all the family had retired to rest, and, taking her place at the piano, began Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Before she had proceeded very far, the whole house was aroused by the unusual disturbance, but when her father came to the door and gazed on the little white-robed figure, looking for once the very picture of docility, he had not the heart to chide her, but smiled indulgently as he carried her back to bed. At this time she remembers that her favorite songs were Comin' Through the Rye and Nellie Bly, the latter winning her favor because the heroine was a namesake. The playthings of the average little girl had no attraction for Nellie. Dolls were entirely outside her interest, but for a wooden rocking horse equipped with tail and mane of orthodox hair she developed quite an inordinate affection, and for several years regarded the donor, Mr. Newbigin, who had long been confidential manager to her father, as a being more wonderful than any Santa Claus. The little girl's early education was directed by 2 aunts, sisters of Mrs. Mitchell, and their old pupil is never tired of recalling instances of their competence and their patient kindness to her. My Aunt Lizzie, she writes, possessed a soprano voice of extraordinary beauty. I can clearly remember the perfect control with which she used it, and the facility of her execution, even in the highest pianissimo passages. I feel sure she would have made a brilliant success had she become a public singer. Love of mischief led Nellie Mitchell into all sorts of misdemeanors, and as a measure of repression she was sent as a boarder to Lee House, a school in Bridge Road, Richmond, standing on high ground, from the upstairs windows of which she could see the Tower of Dunside. This possibility intensified her grief over the new order of things, and for hours at a time she would stand at the window screaming piteously to be taken home. When Mr. Mitchell heard of this, he made a point of passing Lee House whenever he went in or out of the city, so that she might be consoled by seeing him. But the sight of her father only made matters worse, and when she espied him in a buggy or on top of a bus she cried so much more that the boarding school was set down as a failure, and she was taken home. Dunside, Richmond, Melbourne. When old enough, Nellie was sent to the Presbyterian Ladies' College in East Melbourne, a scholastic establishment of the very highest standing, where she took fair advantage of the admirable opportunities offered, without ever becoming in any sense a brilliant pupil, except in the department of music, where she was consistently and conspicuously successful. Willful, daring, uncompromisingly frank, and possessed of inexhaustible energy and irrepressible spirits, she was constantly in trouble, the ringleader in every turmoil, and the unabashed confessor of her foibles. Together with the ordinary subjects of a girl's education she took up singing, and received a certain number of lessons from Madame Christian, a well-known professional singer, who has since become a nun, and now successfully directs the music school at St. Vincent's Convent, Sydney. But these were not a matter of serious attention then, and her best and fullest thought was given to the pianoforte and organ, which at a very early age she could play extremely well. In early girlhood she became an expert in the art of whistling, an accomplishment which in later years she often put to practical use when studying operatic rules, and as this attainment was supposed to be peculiarly shocking to the sentiments of the Presbyterian College teachers, it was in a corresponding degree particularly admired by the pupils, who were never tired of hearing her whistle the popular airs of the day. By way of variety, her young comrades would often cluster round her, and say, "And now, Nellie, make that funny noise in your throat, this being the earliest appreciation of the natural trill which was subsequently to serve her so admirably in her professional career. The opinion has been hazarded that her juvenile feats as a whistler may have helped in the development of the unrivaled breath control for which she is now famous. The whole of her school days were spent in the city of Melbourne, but her holidays were divided between the different country places belonging to her father. She was particularly well known at Lilydale, a pretty township which, owing to its close proximity to Melbourne, from which it is only distant about 24 miles, was a regular visiting place of the family. Here Nellie Mitchell rode, drove, fished, and romped generally, with an amount of hilarious zest that bewildered the staid and delighted the joyous of the neighborhood. No prandial was too wild, no mischief too disconcerting, for her. Returning from an extended holiday in South Gippsland on one occasion, she was so delighted at getting back to the city, that on the final stage of the journey, a coach drive from Hastings to Melbourne, she allowed neither man, woman, nor child to pass without calling out some joyous and mirth-provoking greeting. An incident of my childhood that has often been told against me, said Melba not long ago, relates to one of my visits to a country place of my father's when I was about 12 years of age. I was furious when I found there was no piano in the house, and refused to be comforted when my mother drew my attention to a dislocated harmonium and a concertina, which it was hoped might satisfy me. In teaching myself the concertina I eventually whiled away many an hour, but when that was finished I was again most dissatisfied because there wasn't a piano. In these outlying bush districts it was then the custom, and, indeed, is today, for a clergyman or lay preacher to come along on Sundays, and at the principal homesteads hold service for the family, the servants, and the station hands, who at shearing time often make quite a large congregation. On one of these occasions we were visited by a worthy man who preached a very long and, as we children thought, a very dull sermon. When he finished he suggested that we should sing a hymn, and my mother asked me to play it on the harmonium, but I was so wearied by the discourse, and so full of my grievance in regard to the piano, that my feelings got the better of me, and instead of the hymn I played with great vigor You Should See Me Dance the polka, to the consternation, even horror, of my father and mother, who sent me to bed for the remainder of the day. Bubbling over with health and spirits, Nellie Mitchell's childhood was one continuous term of joyous revolt against any kind of restraint, and in consigning her to a day's confinement within the narrow walls of her bedroom her parents had selected the most telling of all reasonable punishments. She hated to be still herself, and she hated to see other people still, particularly if they, as a consequence, exacted quietude from her. Her father and his brothers were fond of playing whist, and often sat for hours at the game, their keenness in the contest making them anxious for the utmost quiet in the room where they played. During one of these long drawn-out séances Nellie's patience became quite exhausted. Procuring a pair of bellows, she silently stole under the table, and, placing her weapon of attack in position, blew a mighty blast up the leg of her uncle's trousers, a proceeding which speedily demoralized the whist party. When I was about 12 or 13 years of age, says Melba, I had what then seemed to me a real adventure. I was making good progress with my music, and received permission to practice occasionally on the grand organ of the Scots Church, where my people worshipped, and where my father now and then sang in the choir. Late one afternoon I stopped playing, and sat at the keyboard thinking. I remained there for some considerable time, and when at last I made my way to the door, I found I was locked in. The verger, believing that I had gone, had bolted and barred the doors. In a moment I worked myself into a perfect agony of mind. The church was already dark, and the pulpit and organ, in their grey dust sheets, looked like some dreadful spectres. A night alone in such a place, I thought, would drive me mad. The frenzy was already asserting itself, when I heard a key in the door. The verger had returned for something he had forgotten, and I was released from my terrifying solitude. On another occasion, a blazing midsummer day it was, when the pleasures of sea bathing seemed particularly alluring, Nellie and a little girl friend set out for the old Stubbs baths, which at that time were approached on one side across a miry swamp bridged by a long narrow plank. The great probability of mishap for anyone who did not step with care had no deterrent effect on Nellie, who at once began to run up and down the narrow swaying board at an alarming speed. The inevitable happened, and she overbalanced herself into the quagmire beneath, from which she afterwards emerged entirely covered with mud. In all her frolics she kept a close eye on the neatness of her person, and the unwelcome coat of mire filled her with impatience for its removal. Hurrying to the baths, she secured her ticket and instantly plunged into the sea, without removing her clothes. Paddling about until the mud was washed from her garments, she then changed into the regulation bathing dress, and played in the water until the sun had dried her ordinary attire, in which, through her resourcefulness, she was finally able to make a fairly presentable appearance on the return trip home. It is only to be expected that old Melbourne playmates and friends should delight to recall memories of the many wild frolics into which Nellie Mitchell so gaily entered in these early days, and it is told of her that on one occasion, during the temporary absence of the driver, she nimbly mounted the front seat of an omnibus, and drove the public conveyance down one of the principal streets of the city at a pace that sent the frightened pedestrians scurrying in all directions. Early evidence of a leaning towards dramatic personation is given in a practical joke planned at the expense of her father. The nuns belonging to one of the Melbourne convents were engaged in a work of charity which necessitated a house-to-house canvass for subscriptions. Nellie knew of this, and at a suitable opportunity improvised the dress of a religieuse, and, with the assistance of the servants, got to the front door without being seen by any members of the family. She then rang, stated her mission, and begged an audience of Mr. Mitchell, who presented himself with some reluctance. With downcast eyes and gentle voice she pleaded the cause of the convent charity with such success that her father, who did not see quite clearly why he, a Presbyterian, should support a Catholic institution, at length gave her a sovereign. When he found out the trick played on him by his daughter, he was easily persuaded to let her retain the donation for herself. Her early years were passed under the happiest conditions. Given good health, an attractive home, numerous holidays, full means for their complete enjoyment, and the tenderest parental care, she flourished in body and mind, and, despite, or perhaps because of, her hilarious escapades, became the darling of the family, whose devotion she amply returned in her own frank, unpretentious manner. For the adequate encouragement of her musical progress an organ was built into the drawing-room at Dunside, and she was given frequent opportunity to hear whatever notable musicians visited Australia. Her criticism of the artists was often of so severe a character that her mother, as a wise measure of repression, occasionally left Nellie at home when taking the other children to these concerts. All the other members of the family invariably expressed the keenest delight over the performances, but her approval was not so easily won, and where she thought there was reason for adverse criticism she gave it unreservedly, to the especial discomfort of her mother, who feared that the precocious judgment of the child indicated a want of musical sympathy and appreciation. Madame Arabella Goddard was the first artist to leave an impression of unusual gifts on the mind of the young critic. It was at this period that she conceived the idea of herself performing at a real concert in the drawing-room at Dunside, and she carried through all the preliminaries with perfect completeness. Her father, seeing in this entertainment a possible step towards the professional life which had already been suggested for his daughter, and which he both feared and opposed, sent round to all the family friends and begged them not to attend. His canvass among her prospective audience was very successful, for only 2 people presented themselves on the day fixed for the concert. She, however, neither stormed, nor wept, nor made a fuss of any kind. She just took her music and went through the arranged program as formally, as cheerfully, and as carefully, as though her audience of 2 had been an overflowing house at London or Paris on a gala night. On another occasion, while still in the amateur status, she organized a concert at Sorrento, Victoria, where she was holiday-making with her family, the object being to provide a new fence for the local cemetery, the dilapidated appearance of which had appealed to her kind heart through her order-loving eye. She had used up all available funds on the expenses of preparation, and, when the bill posting came to be done, had no money in hand to pay for that item. Unwilling to sacrifice valuable time and burden the concert with any unavoidable expenses, she at once resolved on a novel means of escape from the dilemma, and, armed with a brush and a pot of paste, she went out after sunset and did the bill posting herself, making a particularly good show on the cemetery fence that was to be repaired by her efforts. At the concert she sang The Angel at the Window, Tours, and Sing, Sweet Bird, Gans, receiving much applause from the audience, which completely filled the Mechanics' Institute. The newspaper accounts described the concert as quite above the ordinary amateur standard, and upwards of £20 was realized for the cemetery funds as the outcome of her good management. It was in 1881, before Nellie's voice had ever been formally heard in public, that the death of her mother brought her the first experience of a real sorrow. So very deep was the impression created by this bereavement that she can even now recall with poignant realism every detail of that scene of sadness. The affection existing between mother and daughter was one of unusual tenderness, and on the first copy of a photograph of herself, taken in Paris at the time of her debut, she wrote an inscription to the unforgotten dead, "To my dear mother and best friend." Page 13, Chapter 2. On December 22, 1882, at Brisbane, Queensland, took place the marriage of Charles Nesbitt Frederick Armstrong, youngest son of the late Sir Andrew Armstrong, Bart, of Gallon Priory, Kings County, Ireland, to Helen Porter Mitchell, eldest daughter of David Mitchell, of Dunside, Richmond, Melbourne. Mr. Mitchell had welcomed the marriage of his daughter as the sure termination of her aspirations after a professional life, and in paying Senior Secchi and her other teachers for the tuition received up to that date he felt a certain parental satisfaction that there would be no more disturbing music lessons. She spent the whole of 1883 in Queensland, where her husband was interested in sugar growing. During this term the future prima donna had a narrow escape from drowning. Mr. Armstrong took his wife and a guest out in a small sailing boat at Port Mackay, and on crossing the bar they were soon in difficulties. A squall struck the little craft, which was overturned, and the 3 occupants were immersed in the deep waters of the Pacific. They succeeded in holding on to the upturned boat until assistance arrived from the pilot station, where the lookout man had fortunately witnessed the accident. The heat and the monotony of life in North Queensland were not at all to the liking of Mrs. Armstrong, who almost regarded the yacht capsize as a welcome break in the dull routine of life. Miss Mitchell's marriage made a very considerable break in her musical studies, but at every possible opportunity she endeavored to improve herself as a performer on the organ and piano. Her principal teachers on these instruments were Mr. Julius Bud D., Mr. Gannett, and Madame Charbonnet-Kellerman, the last a clever Frenchwoman, whose daughter, Miss Annette Kellerman, has been much in the public eye of late years as the champion woman swimmer of the world. From early girlhood Mrs. Armstrong played the organ on many occasions at the Scots Church, Collins Street, and as a contributor of piano and organ solos she soon came to be in wide request for amateur musical functions. Her success as a musical amateur and other circumstances led to a wide popularity, which eventually came to be a considerable tax on her available financial resources, and this condition provided an extra and welcome excuse for her adoption of the professional life, to which she had always felt herself drawn. She had taken singing lessons at intermittent periods from Signor Pietro Secchi, a retired Italian singer, and as a result she now and again sang at some small private parties, where, however, her piano solos were always the main attraction. Over and over again it was freely stated that if she became a professional pianist she would be sure to make a pronounced success. At one of these private musical soirees given at Government House, Melbourne, Mrs. Armstrong supplemented her pianoforte solos by a vocal selection. At the conclusion of the latter, the late Marchioness of Normanby, wife of the then Governor of Victoria, said, "Child, you play brilliantly, but you sing better. Some day you will give up the piano for singing, and then you will become famous." This was at a time when everyone had been thinking of Mrs. Armstrong as a possible pianist, and so it was that Lady Normanby was the first person to suggest the career of a singer for the young amateur. This lady's prediction shifted the whole channel of Mrs. Armstrong's thoughts, and on Saturday, May 17, 1884, as a pupil of Senior Secchi, she made her first public appearance as a singer at a complimentary concert for the benefit of her Elsasser, a local musician who had been overtaken by misfortune. Thenceforward her reputation in Australia as a vocalist began to grow, and during the latter part of that year and throughout 1885 she regularly sang at concerts. The first regular engagement she received was from Mr. George Musgrove, of Williamson, Garner, and Musgrove, the well-known Anglo-Australian impresarios, who gave her £2 a week during a concert season. Allowing for 4 concerts a week, this sum would work out at about £5 for each concert, terms which Mrs. Armstrong considered quite satisfactory. 17 years later, when she had become the most famous prima donna of the day, Mr. Musgrove was once more the impresario of her Australian concert tour, during which the receipts on one occasion at Sydney reached such a figure that her net share of the proceeds was £2,350, the largest sum ever paid to any singer in any part of the world for a single evening's vocalization. The most important engagement she fulfilled in 1885 was for the initial tour just mentioned, with the Cruise concert party, which was headed by a very clever compatriot, Mr. Johann Cruise, who had already won liberal fame in Europe as a violinist, and at whose home in Richmond, Melbourne, Miss Mitchell had already found many opportunities of reveling in that musical atmosphere which she so sincerely loved. The Australian public, as a whole, did not regard Mrs. Armstrong as a vocal marvel, but the newspaper critics, in the most wholehearted manner, proclaimed her remarkable gifts, and she worked on with untiring energy towards the perfection of her musical heritage. But because of the easy circumstances of her family, her early marriage to a man of good prospects, or some non-evident cause, the Australian public never allowed her to separate herself entirely from the ranks of the amateur, and when, after 18 months' experience, she decided to try her fortune in Europe, it could not be reasonably claimed that the people of her own country recognized in her the possibilities of future greatness. In December 1885, she sang in Sydney, New South Wales, with the Sydney Liedertafel and the Sydney Philharmonic Society, and on each occasion, especially for her share in the latter's production of The Messiah under the conductorship of Monsieur Henri Kowalski, she received the warm commendation of the critics. A month later, Mrs. Armstrong gave a farewell concert on January 22 at the Masonic Hall, Sydney, when the Honourable Daniel O'Connor, on behalf of her friends, presented her with a handsome gold badge, which Lady Carrington affixed on her breast. Lord Carrington was at that time Governor of New South Wales, and he and Lady Carrington on that evening began the friendship which has been kept up ever since. Towards the close of 1885, Mrs. Armstrong was engaged as principal soprano in the choir of St. Francis's Roman Catholic Church in Melbourne, then and now noted for its splendid musical service. She regarded this recognition of her musical progress as very encouraging. Perhaps it is because of it that, although she still belongs to the denomination of her forefathers, she cherishes a lingering interest in all things appertaining to the Roman Catholic Church, the picturesque ritual and romantic traditions of which would in any case appeal to her artistic sense. On severing her connection with this choir as a preliminary to her departure for England in March 1886, the members presented her with an illuminated valedictory address, couched in terms of extreme eulogy and goodwill. She had only been with them for 4 months, and the kindly feeling which they showed, in spite of the brevity of the association and the difference of faith, may be cited as an early instance of that power of winning strong regard which has since become one of the happiest features of her personality. During Mrs. Armstrong's brief Australian career as a singer, she appeared in different cities of the eastern states with varying financial success. Severed engagements of considerable local importance fell to her lot, but in a bid for the sustained support of the public, through the medium of a concert tour given during January 1886, she was rewarded by such scanty patronage that in some cases the receipts did not cover the rent of the hall. Now, as has already been mentioned, when back again in Melbourne, more than a year after her marriage, Mrs. Armstrong had, on the pressing invitation of Senior Secchi, resumed her singing lessons with him at such irregular intervals as her circumstances would allow. These lessons had been continued during 1885, but with greater irregularity, owing to her frequent absences from Melbourne at the concert engagements she fulfilled in that year at Sydney, Ballarat, Bendigo, Hamilton, and other places. In Melbourne, too, her concert appearances were many, if not very lucrative. Under these circumstances, Senior Secchi had said that he would make no charge for these intermittent lessons, but that, if she ever made the success which he believed she would make, she could then pay him, an arrangement not unusual in the musical profession. How liberal that payment would have been those who know the singer can easily understand. All this time her heart was set on seeking fame in Europe, an ambition which Senior Secchi consistently encouraged. Towards securing funds for the purpose of travel and study, she gave concerts in New South Wales and Victoria, which, as already stated, ended in financial failure. Thus, at the beginning of 1886, she was still, apparently, far from the realization of her dream. Her father had by this time become convinced that her craving for an active life in music must be seriously reckoned with, and when he was appointed Victorian Commissioner to the Indian and Colonial Exhibition held in London that year, he invited Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong to accompany him, and agreed to pay for a year's lessons under whatever teacher she selected. The farewell concert in Sydney had left a small financial balance to her credit, and that held in Melbourne realized the modest sum of £65. Supplementary to her father's assistance, this money would help to pay for clothes and the other expenses necessarily incidental to her ambitious undertaking. When everything was settled, and when the prospect of a fair start seemed favorable, Senior Secchi, acting on foolish advice, or for some other reason, applied for immediate payment at full rates for the lessons he had given her during the preceding 20 months. At first the young singer was so astounded that she regarded the demand as a joke, but her momentary doubt was soon and sadly dispelled. Once again it seemed that the great desire of her life was to be thwarted, and this time by the teacher she had always gratefully esteemed as a friend. Fearful lest the knowledge of Senior Secchi's action should reach her family, and revive their scarcely dormant opposition to her professional aspirations, she was reduced to a state of great mental embarrassment, and designed one expedient after another, until she finally found a friend willing to lend her the money for the satisfaction of her teacher's account. When she got the loan, she paid to the last penny the full amount of Senior Secchi's claim, which may have been made in a moment of chagrin or misunderstanding, but which, nevertheless, filled her with sorrow and disappointment. Then she drove the circumstance from her memory, or at least appeared to do so, for the name of Senior Secchi never again escaped her lips, and if she has been resolutely silent as to his share in her early vocal training, her lips have also been as resolute in the still more characteristic silence that refused to link his name with one word of blame. The Governor of Victoria and Lady Locke were the principals in the audience at the Melbourne Town Hall on Saturday, March 6, the occasion of Mrs. Armstrong's farewell concert in her native colony, now state. Here again the critics were unanimous in their praise, and if during the 2 preceding years the public had not given the young singer the support she deserved, it was not through want of intelligent direction on the part of the authorities to whom musical amateurs usually look for guidance. In the years that followed, the Australian people were so fearful lest they should allow another Melba to go forth to the great world of Europe without proper recognition, that every local vocal aspirant who announced her intention of seeking European fame was rewarded with exceptional evidence of public interest and generosity. On March 11, 1886, Mrs. Armstrong, accompanied by her husband and baby and her father, sailed for England preparatory to entering on her task as a student of grand opera, in which domain of music she had now definitely decided to endeavor to make a name. This decision on the part of one who had never heard grand opera, in whose environment there was not a single fostering element towards that goal, and whose young life was already largely filled by her husband and little son, was in itself striking evidence of the independence of her character, and of that mysterious call which guides the destinies of the singer who is born, not made. Page 21, Chapter 3. On May 4, 1886, a few days after her first arrival in England, at the opening of the Indian and Colonial Exhibition in London, Madame Albany sang Home, Sweet Home, and at its conclusion Mrs. Armstrong, who had listened throughout with rapt attention, remarked, with a gratified sigh, "That's worth coming from Melbourne to hear." This initial element of greatness, the ability to appreciate greatness in others, was early manifest in Melba, who in the succeeding years has given constant evidence of the most wholehearted camaraderie. The indefinable inner persuasion as to future success in a musical career which Mrs. Armstrong had felt in a vague way since her earliest childhood, and the confidence in this future which later years definitely developed, were not destined to receive any impetus during the period immediately following her first arrival in England. She sought a hearing wherever possible, from persons of established positions in the world of music, and the opinion they expressed was not calculated to cheer the young Australian in her self-imposed task of winning operatic fame. As ill luck would have it, Sir Hubert Parry had been forced to make a rule against hearing in private the applicants for musical distinction who were just then arriving in shoals, and so could not even grant her a hearing for which she had asked. The late Sir Arthur Sullivan did not consider her vocal attainments sufficiently good to justify his suggesting her inclusion in the Savoy Opera Company, although he did add that, if she worked hard, he might be able to get her an engagement in the Mikado after a year's further study. The prospect of entering the musical profession through the medium of light opera, however, had no real attraction for her. After an interview with Senior Alberto Randegger, Mrs. Armstrong received the disheartening intimation that he did not feel warranted in accepting her as a pupil. In after years Sir Arthur and Senior Randegger were numbered among her warmest friends and admirers, and on many an occasion of triumph for her she used to tease them both for their early want of confidence in her powers, a want of confidence probably justified by some temporary circumstance. The result of these setbacks on the young and ambitious Australian, just arrived in a country of the conditions of which she knew little or nothing, reduced her to considerable depression, yet in no way interfered with her determination to fight for success. The first glimpse of encouragement she received in London was from Mr. Wilhelm Gans, who pronounced a favourable opinion on her voice, and gave her an opportunity to sing at Emil Bach's concert in Prince's Hall on June 1, 1886, and also at the dinner of the Royal General Theatrical Fund in the Freemasons' Hall. She had brought a letter of introduction from Mr. A. Sellier to Mr. Gans, who further made an appointment for her with Mr. Carl Rosa, but the note of appointment which the manager had penciled on his cuff as a reminder escaped his attention, and when she called at Mr. Gans's house in Harley Street, where the meeting was to take place, he was not there. She waited long and patiently, but he never came, and, although most anxious for an opening, it is characteristic of her that she could not be induced to make a second appointment with the momentarily careless manager. Mrs. Armstrong soon realized the advisability of entering on a term of study abroad, and she went to Paris and presented herself to Madame Mathilde Marchesi, to whom she bore a letter of introduction from Madame Elise Wiedermann Pinschoff, wife of the Austro-Hungarian consul at Melbourne, herself a singer and teacher of considerable reputation. Madame Marchesi's reception of her visitor was very cordial, and after the young aspirant had sung her first song, the veteran teacher turned away, and, without speaking, hurried to the door of the apartment. Mrs. Armstrong, already severely disappointed by expert opinion in London, was in a state of acute eagerness for Madame Marchesi's pronouncement, and when the old lady moved as if to leave the room, the few intervening moments seemed like so many hours. On reaching the door, Madame Marchesi, without any preliminary, called to her husband, "Salvatore, Salvatore. At last I have found a star." The relief which this announcement gave to the waiting student was unbounded, and, as she has often since remarked, she then considered herself already well advanced towards her ideal. Marchesi's fear seemed to be that the newcomer would not take her art very seriously, and on this score she questioned her closely. Taking both the Australian's hands in hers, she said, "Mrs. Armstrong, Are you serious?" "Yes," answered the other simply. "Then," added Madame Marchesi with great emphasis and decision, "if you are serious, and can study with me for 1 year, I will make something extraordinary of you." The old lady pronounced the word extraordinary in 2 quite distinct words, as though by this means she could more forcibly impress on Mrs. Armstrong the possibilities of her future. The new student quickly gave ample evidence of absolute earnestness, untiring industry, and exceptional intelligence, qualities which were of incalculable value in the development of her natural musical equipment. She was consumed with ambition, and no self-sacrifice was too great if it brought her nearer the realization of her lifelong dream. At first Madame Marchesi was puzzled as to where she should place her latest pupil, who regarded it as a very happy chance that all the preparatory sections of the Marchesi school were full, thus giving an opportunity for her immediate entrance into the opera class without any of the usual preliminaries. To one so young and high-spirited as Mrs. Armstrong, to whom the adoption of a profession was, after all, more a matter of pleasure than of necessity, Paris, than little less than fairyland to her untravelled eye, must have made a strong demand for the dissipation of her time. But no plans for sightseeing or amusement interfered with her exemplary industry. Every day she devoted 8 hours at least to the study of music, as a matter of course using her voice very little, but using her brain in the mastery of technique, theory, and traditions. Madame Mathilde Marchesi in Melba during the early days of her studies in Paris, when going through the mad scene from Lucia, Madame Marchesi was so severe with Melba that the pupil burst into tears, and, hurrying from the room, resolved to discontinue her lessons. Melba is not prone to hasty resolutions, and when she determines to do a thing, she generally does it. While waiting to banish the evidence of her recent tears, Marchesi came into the room, and, throwing her arms round the dissatisfied student, said, "Nellie, Nellie, you know I love you. If I bother you, it is because I know you will be great. Come back and sing as I wish." This affectionate and tactful appeal was sufficient for Melba, who has often said that, if she had gone away that day without a reconciliation, the whole trend of her career would probably have been altered. Unlike the great majority of students, Mrs. Armstrong's time was necessarily divided by the irresistible claims of a husband and infant son. Madame Marchesi's attention and interest were lavishly given to her pupil, for whom she evinced as much affection and consideration as though she were her own daughter. At a matinée musicale given by the distinguished teacher at her residence in the Rue Jouffroy, Paris, during December of 1886, the Australian soprano was included in the program, and for the first time sang under the name of Madame Melba, an appellation happily derived from Melbourne *, her native city, and since made famous in all parts of the civilized world. The idea of the change of name originated with the teacher, but the name itself was the suggestion of the pupil, both having every reason to be satisfied with a selection which had the merit of brevity and euphony, linked to that of ease of spelling and pronunciation for every nation in Europe. At this matinée Ambrose Thomas was present, and heard Melba sing the mad scene from his opera of Hamlet, in the study of which he subsequently gave her great assistance. Even at this stage her efforts won warm approval from the general audience, and the newspaper critics who were present voiced their praise in the Figaro, La Liberté, Le Sport, and other publications. Ambrose Thomas, who took a deep interest in her later progress, encouraged her by warm compliments, and on that day began for her an invaluable friendship with the great composer, who in the succeeding years always addressed her as Ma Belle Belle. Another incident of that musicale was the engagement of Madame Melba by Mr. Maurice Strakusch for a term of years, a contract from which she was freed by his lamented death at a time when he and the management of the Brussels Opera House were both presenting a claim for her services. Melba was born on the anniversary of the proclamation of Melbourne as a town by Governor Burke, so that her own birthday and that of her native city occur on the same date. Strakusch, who was practically the first to recognize the remarkable gifts of Adelina Patti, was a man of unusual discrimination, and his first hearing of Melba made an instantaneous impression. He was enjoying a cigar in the smoking room of Madame Marquesse's house, when the strains of Caro Nome, as sung by the Australian student, rang out from the music studio. He put aside his cigar, listened in silence to the end, and then said to Marquesse's husband, the Marquis Castron de la Rajatha, "I want that voice. I do not know whether she is short or tall, pretty or plain, I want her." During these student days in Paris, Melba was fortunate enough to meet both Gounod and Leo Delibes, as well as Ambrose Thomas, and their interest and friendship had an enormous influence in the quickening of her artistic instinct. Facsimile page by Ambrose Thomas, page 27, Chapter 4. Nelly Melba, mon ami chéri et elle livre de mes rêves avant qu'elle fût mon idéal de l'artiste. Mathilde Marquesse. After 9 months' preparation in the Marquesse school, Madame Melba made her first appearance on the operatic stage at the Théâtre de la Monnaie, Brussels, on Thursday, October 1887, as Gilda in Verdi's Rigoletto. From the first she was announced as a star, and the result of that evening more than justified the unusual course which the management had adopted with regard to the young singer. The supporting cast included Monsieur Engel as the Duke and Monsieur Seguin as the Jester, while the conductor's chair was occupied by Monsieur Dupont, who had already made a high reputation in London. The whole performance was admirable, but the success of Madame Melba, who had only had 3 stage rehearsals, stood out definite and emphatic, and the morrow found her already famous. News of her triumph was telegraphed all over Europe, and managers and other connoisseurs hurried to Brussels to hear her. Every paper in the Belgian capital accepted her as a singer born to greatness, and for whatever dramatic shortcomings she showed on this her first stage appearance, the Brussels critics were ready with reasonably sympathetic explanations. This attitude was all the more commendable since the traditions of the local opera had to a necessary extent been set at defiance by the fact that Madame Melba sang in Italian instead of French, the official tongue of the Monet stage. Although she had a good knowledge of the French language, Melba at that time had not freed herself from an objectionable English accent. In order to introduce the Australian singer under the best possible conditions, the directors ran the risk of offending many of their patrons by making the above-mentioned concession. But even this circumstance, and the known fact of her inexperience, seemed to help, rather than hinder, the readiness of her acceptance by a generous public. The Independence Belge next day wrote of her as a revelation, and described her voice as unique in quality, with a remarkable trill and perfect technique, while her person was described as elegant and distinguished, and her face mobile and sympathetic. Melba was also complimented on her intelligence in acting. The Étoile Belge was equally favorable, and, accepting her also as a revelation and a star, boldly placed the young Antipodean with the profile of an empress in the same category with Patti and Nielsen. Veteran connoisseurs said they could not believe their ears when they heard her incomparable crystal voice. La Chronique, in dwelling on the sensation of the day, alluded to the warm, velvety quality of her superb voice, her trill of mathematical exactitude, her distinguished and gracious presence and sympathetic face. Le Ménestrel noted that she sang with remarkable sentiment, style, and expression. La Réforme was enthusiastic over the exceptional purity of her voice and the charm of her singing, and La Patriote, in a summary of her success, said, "Before 2 years Madame Melba will be known as La Melba." All the papers were in the same vein, and, as it happened, within a single month the Brussels critics designated the young novice La Melba. Madame Marchesi, who had come to Brussels for her pupil's debut, was delighted. The Queen of the Belgians attended the opera for Melba's second performance, and before the evening was over said, "It is the most beautiful voice I have ever heard." Her Majesty summoned Melba to her box to congratulate her, and thenceforward became her most enthusiastic patron. The second opera in which Melba appeared at Brussels was Traviata. Referring to this time, she has said, "How little I then realized the pitfalls and difficulties of the career I had chosen." The opinion of the management and the criticisms of Rigoletto had been highly gratifying, so I was next given the leading role in Traviata. The vocal demands of this part, although so heavy, I could reasonably fill, but the stage requirements were exceptionally exacting for a novice, and one of the newspapers in the next day's notice dwelt on my evident inexperience. This was the first paper I saw, and, although all the others were full of generous encouragement, I could not forget the one snub. I cried almost incessantly for a whole week at the recollection of this particular criticism. Then I took heart again, and threw myself into my studies with fresh vigor, resolved to work until I got to the top. The date of the Traviata production was November 9, 1887, only 3 weeks after her debut, and in its criticism of this role the Étoile Belge said, "Those who were at the last representation of Rigoletto were able to note the great progress made by Madame Melba in the scenic interpretation of the part of Gilda, and how this exquisite singer was asserting herself as a comedian. Even they will have been surprised at the really remarkable manner in which she has composed the part of the Traviata." We felt sure that she would invest the character with rare distinction, a charming physiognomy, and all the seductions of a marvelous voice, but we could scarcely expect that she would have so completely understood and rendered its touching features, the phases of passion and tenderness, and the heartrending conclusion. Not only is it Violetta the perfect Italian singer, but it is also Dumas' Marguerite Gautier. Her person and deportment are perfectly adapted to the portrait as depicted by Dumas. The third character in which she was presented to the Belgian public was Lucia in Donizetti's opera of Lucia di Lammermoor. The greatest interest was aroused by this announcement, and the house was crowded for the occasion. Her previous success was further emphasized, and her singing in the mad scene created an extraordinary impression. While resident in Brussels, Monsieur Gavert became greatly attached to her little boy, and often invited the child to lunch with him on Sundays. One of these occasions provided an awkward moment for Melba. Close to the distinguished director's house a funeral procession passed, and, replying to a question from Master George, Monsieur Gavert, a fine, vigorous man, apparently in the prime of life, but with a manner grave even for his years, explained that the procession meant death, which came to all when very old. The child looked at his host, and, with embarrassing candor, said, "Tu dois mourir bientôt, parce que tu es bien vieux, tu sais." 2 facsimile pages by Elo Delibes, 1. 2 facsimile pages by Elo Delibes, 2, page 27, chapter 5 Votre voix idéal avec un purite surhumain. L. Delibes. For some months Melba had been preparing Leo Delibes' opera Lakmé, and had experienced the inestimable advantage of studying it with the composer himself. All the time possible she had devoted to perfecting herself in the French language, yet immediately before the production, which took place on March 8, 1888, the directors held a meeting, which Monsieur Delibes attended, at which it was discussed whether, in view of Melba's still unsatisfactory accent, it would be advisable to permit her to sing in that tongue. It was then that Delibes, who was enraptured with the young singer's interpretation of his work, broke in, "Tu elle chante Lakmé en français, en italien, en allemand, en anglais, ou en chinois, cela m'est égal, mais tu elle la chante." In spite of the slight difficulty with the language in which she then sang publicly for the first time, Melba made another striking success, and the verdict of the composer was repeated by the critics and the whole opera-going public. Madame Melba then rigorously continued her French studies under Mademoiselle Tordius, a most accomplished professor, and, by giving 6 hours a day to this section of her work, soon became a complete master of the language. The last opera in which Melba was presented during her initial season at Brussels was Hamlet, given at the Théâtre de la Monnaie in April 1888, before a brilliant audience. Here again the Australian singer was peculiarly favored in having her study of the part personally guided by the composer, who had heard her as a student at the Marquesi School, and whose gratification over her impersonation led to his description, "The Ophélie of my dreams." The Queen of the Belgians sent for Ambrose Thomas, and, in offering her congratulations, reminded him that she was then but renewing the greeting she had extended to him 17 years earlier, when Hamlet had its initial representation in Brussels. Her Majesty also sent for Melba, to whom she repeated her assurances of unbounded admiration. This opera led but to the repetition of all the eulogy that had been bestowed on her earlier roles, and by this time Melba had become the spoiled child of the public, the darling of Brussels. Never had success been more immediate and emphatic. Never had any prima donna so surely secured a place in the hearts of the people. It was, therefore, with very fair hopes that Madame Melba looked forward to an appearance in London. A young British singer coming before a British audience would, she argued, be sure of a sympathetic, if not a generous, verdict. Melba as Lakmé, page 33, chapter 6. Melba's art is as spontaneous as the murmur of the brook. She sings because she must sing. François-Auguste Gavert. Madame Melba made her operatic debut at Covent Garden, London, on Thursday, May 24, 1888. Notwithstanding the immediate and sustained success which she had made at Brussels during the preceding season, a success to which Sir, then Mr. Augustus Harris attached unflinching faith, her acceptance by the London critics was a matter of tardy growth. In operatic circles a good deal had been said beforehand about the remarkable beauty of Melba's voice, and the audience assembled for her first appearance expressed their appreciation in hearty and oft-repeated applause. The opera chosen for Melba's introduction to the London public was Lucia di Lammermoor, which many of the critics considered too conventional a vehicle on which to base their definite judgment. Her second appearance was in Rigoletto, with Scalchi and D'Andrade. It is curious to recall that the quality of the voice and the perfection of vocal method, on which they have since lavished every possible measure of praise, did not, for some reason or other, strongly appeal to the critical faculty as a body on the occasion of the young Australian singer's entrance into the ranks of Covent Garden artists. In view of some subsequent expressions of opinion by the same critics as to Melba's dramatic qualities, opinions which in later years were once more reversed, and generously reversed. It is curious to recall that during her first London season, when she was practically without any stage experience, she was generally accepted as a promising actress. Brief extracts from the criticisms of the day on the first two roles she essayed, Lucia and Gilda, are appended. The Times. Madame Melba availed herself of the dramatic opportunities to considerable advantage, and especially the painful scene with her father in the Duke's palace was realized with truth as well as delicacy. The Daily Telegraph. In moments of intense feeling she is capable of striking effects that seem spontaneous. The Daily Chronicle. She appears to have mastered the dramatic features of the character she represents. The Morning Post. Her admirable interpretation of the dramatic situation in the marriage scene inspired all those who were concerned with her. The Standard. Her capacity as an actress is quite sufficient to render all possible justice to the character. The Pall Mall Gazette. Accomplished in acting. The Observer. Genuine dramatic instinct. Vanity Fair. Displays much emotional power as an actress. The Globe. Her acting was graceful, expressive, and dramatic. The Weekly Advertiser. Acted with much dramatic force and true expression. The Queen. The part really affords no scope for originality of treatment, but she at times gave evidence of ability to portray genuine dramatic passion. The Morning Advertiser. Intelligent dramatically. The Echo. Fine artistic qualities, both from a vocal and dramatic point. The Era. Charming simplicity and expression of style in keeping with the spirit of the character. The Lady's Pictorial. Betrayed in certain scenes a strong dramatic instinct, while her impersonation generally was marked by admirable intelligence and feeling. The Stage. As an actress she has much in her favor. The Musical Standard. Shows dramatic power. The St. James's Gazette. Her dramatic singing in the scenes with the hunchback is very impressive. Still, as a young prima donna it was of the voice and her use of it that she most wished to hear. These expressions of opinion as to her acting capabilities, from those considered best qualified to judge, would have been accepted by any young actress and the public to whom she was appealing as a general acknowledgment of her dramatic gifts. The acceptance should have been all the more ready in view of the fact that, apart from about 30 performances, 4 weeks of the actress's ordinary routine, at Brussels, Melba had never been on a stage in her life. Further, she had never even seen grand opera until during her visit to Paris the year before, and, of the roles she sustained at the Monet, the only one she had seen played was Gilda in Rigoletto, at the close of which she naively confessed that she thought she could sing it better herself. She has never yet witnessed a performance of Lucia, in which she was introduced to the London public, and with which her name, owing to her incomparable rendering of the mad scene, has ever since been intimately and peculiarly associated. Melba was naturally very much gratified by the unexpected appreciation of the dramatic side of her work, which was then at a very undeveloped point, but the criticisms of her voice were entirely different from what she had anticipated, and she made no secret of her disappointment. Although today in a position of such splendid independence, Melba is nevertheless, and despite her natural perseverance and intrepidity, still easily discouraged, and must have been doubly so at the opening of her career. No one nowadays despises more than she the ridiculous adulation which is supposed to be the only coin of address acceptable to a famous prima donna, yet at that time there can be no doubt but that the criticism of praise would have accelerated her artistic expansion. On returning to Paris, Melba, even in the noon of her undiminished student activity, gave much thought to the attitude of the English critics, and, as a consequence, decided that she would relinquish her engagement at Covent Garden for the ensuing season. Mr. Augustus Harris openly stated that if any foreign artist had come to London with the same qualifications as Madame Melba, that foreigner would have been received by the English connoisseurs with unreserved enthusiasm. He was considerably disappointed over the lukewarm praise given to the young colonial, and with prophetic emphasis said, "In a little time they will clamor for Melba above all others, and, by gad, they'll have to pay for her, too." "I wonder," said he, "do the English public ever realize the hardship of their apathy, more especially towards one of their own? The difficulties of an operatic career for any girl are great, but in the case of an Anglo-Saxon they are enormously greater. Take the case of Melba. No matter where she sings in opera for the rest of her life, she will have to use a foreign tongue, and will always be in a position of peculiar and trying isolation, for Britain's contributions to the operatic world are so few that they count for nothing. In an Italian company she will always be surrounded by Italians, in a French company by French, and in a German company by Germans, all zealous for their country's honor. When she sings in New York or London, the same conditions will obtain. Even at Covent Garden the very chorus is made up of foreigners, whose sympathies, like those of the conductor and the principal singers, naturally leaned towards the performers of their native land. Even a sprinkling of her own people in any company where she was singing would be sure to give great courage to an English prima donna. Without that sprinkling she must often feel alone and disheartened. Why, even a man would. It's like Daniel in the lion's den. I know Melba is made of the stuff that will override these circumstances, but I know, too, that the place she will take will be taken in the face of double difficulties, difficulties which foreign artists, who almost invariably sing in their native language, never encounter to anything like the same extent. Was not Miss Edwards, Signora Favanti, an English opera singer whose debut at Her Majesty's in 1844 Lumley described as one long scene of triumph, eventually driven from the stage of her own country and broken in health by the jealousies, misrepresentations, and intrigues of her foreign colleagues and their partisans? It is, however, worth recording that Mr. Harris was then a good deal nettled by the slowness of the London public to recognize the gifts of any artists he presented. This conservatism he accounted inconceivable, especially in the case of the D'Resca brothers. Their success was quicker than usual, he said, but not complete as it should be. With Melba the same sort of thing has happened, and in the middle of the season she came to me with tears in her eyes, and, asking release from her engagement, returned to Brussels. It was subsequently claimed that this very precipitancy deprived the critics of adequate opportunity to appreciate her art, which is so peculiarly unobtrusive that it may be said to require a more intimate knowledge than the showy methods of more sensational singers. In Australia, during the early days of her striving after artistic recognition, the public, apart from the critics, did not evince even ordinary appreciation of her gifts. In America it was only after she had made several appearances that her unusual qualities were fully recognized, and in England there was a still longer period of probation before the establishment of her great artistic position. This hesitancy on the part of English-speaking communities is all the more significant since in Paris, Brussels, Milan, St. Petersburg, Vienna, Berlin, Stockholm, and other centers where music is held to enjoy a wider and fuller understanding than among the Anglo-Saxon race, her success has in each case been instantaneous and emphatic. In October 1888, Melba was back at the Théâtre de la Monnaie for her second season in Brussels, and the flattering reception she received on her reappearance in Lochmay was but a pledge of the ever-growing favour with which the Belgian public regarded her. During the third week of November she again essayed the part of Ophélie in Hamlet, and the critical faculty of Brussels joined in the most cordial commendation of the advance she had made as an interpretative artist since her debut. Every point of progress in voice, acting, bearing, or reading was seized on and held up for approval, and, spurred on by this encouragement, Melba made really admirable progress. Late in February of 1889, probably February 25, Gounod's Romeo and Juliet was staged, in order to present the Australian singer as the daughter of the Capulets. Monsieur Engel was the Romeo of this production, in which Monsieur Maurice Renaud played the role of Capulet. Melba's success in the new role was nothing short of a triumph, and the Belgians lost no opportunity of showing their esteem of the singer, whom they had come to regard as one of themselves, while the Belgian royal family evinced a most unusual interest in the prima donna, who was regularly summoned to the Queen's box to receive Her Majesty's congratulations and encouragement. Up to the time of the tragic death of the Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, the Queen, who had an admirable knowledge of music, had been a regular attendant at the opera on Melba nights. During the Brussels season of 1889 the directors of the Paris Opera had endeavoured to secure Melba for their revival of Romeo and Juliet, but the Brussels management very naturally refused to part with their strongest attraction, and eventually Madame Adelina Patti once again graced the stage of the French house in the Gounod revival. Although Melba was pressed with many demands on the little leisure she could snatch from the routine of a busy student's life, she found time to give her valuable help at charity performances organized in Liège and elsewhere, and she also made successful appearances in oratorio. At the close of the opera term in April, the subscribers presented the departing prima donna with a beautiful diamond as a souvenir of their affection and admiration. To this gift she attaches particular significance, and has ever since treasured it as something specially valued and loved. On the evening of her farewell at the Monet, Melba was so affected by the people's enthusiasm that she was obliged to bury her face in her hands to hide her emotion. She received more than 60 bouquets from her friends and admirers in Brussels, and the occasion naturally left an impression which fondly lingers in the great singer's memory. The English colony in the Belgian capital took a leading part in the demonstration to the young British singer who had won so unique a place in the favour of the city. On April 14, 1889, His Majesty the King of the Belgians presented her with the gold medal of the Brussels Conservatoire, and with this official token of the people's esteem she left the city of her operatic birth. Page 41. Chapter 7 A la chère Juliette que j'espère, à Nelly Melba. Charles Gounod. The termination of Melba's contract at Brussels found her free to accept an engagement at Paris, where she made her debut at the opera on Wednesday, May 8, 1889, as Ophélie in Hamlet. The occasion was one fraught with much anxiety to the newcomer, who rightly estimated the value of a favorable verdict from the French public, and who under the circumstances of her comparative inexperience hardly dared to expect it. Added to her natural nervousness, there were many ulterior circumstances calculated to unnerve the most experienced. The production had been postponed more than once to admit of the appearance of the accepted exponent of the Queen, Madame Richard, who had been incapacitated by a long illness. Late on the afternoon of the day finally decided on for her debut, Monsieur Lassalle, with whom Melba had rehearsed, was stricken with sudden hoarseness, and so she had to appear with a Hamlet whom she had never even seen, a difficulty accentuated further by the fact that she had not been able to have a single rehearsal with the orchestra. In the following day's review of the occasion, Monsieur Auguste Vitu, the eminent music critic of the Figaro, after alluding to these truly exceptional conditions, credited Melba with a success in the earlier portions of the performance, and a triumph after the mad scene which literally moved the audience to frenzy. Continuing, he wrote, Madame Melba possesses a marvelous soprano voice, equal, pure, brilliant, and mellow, remarkably resonant in the middle register, and rising with a perfect pastosità, rich softness, up to the acute regions of that fairy-like major third which is called ut, re, and I above the lines. Her personal appearance was an advantage to her, tall, slender, gifted with an expressive physiognomy. She was applauded in her first duet with Hamlet, de la Lumière, then in the air Mieux vaut mourir, and in the second duet, Les Serments ont de Ailes, to which she gave a dramatic expression rare among our Ophelies, but the occupants of the orchestra stalls, faithful to their temperate habitudes, were disposed to regard it as somewhat exaggerated. Madame Melba was, however, recalled after the fine trio in the third act which drives Ophélie to desperation. Melba asophle. Up to this point all had gone smoothly, without rising above an excellent medium. But in the fourth act the veil was thrown aside. When Ophélie was seen to enter in her white garments, garlanded with flowers, and her fair hair floating down over her shoulders, Madame Melba was transfigured. It was Ophélie herself who charmed all eyes and touched all hearts while interpreting with supreme virtuosity that admirable scene, the most beautiful of all in the masterly work of Ambrose Thomas, which seems to have been dictated to him by the spirit of Shakespeare himself. That which ravished us was not alone the virtuosity, the exceptional quality of that sweetly timbred voice, the facility of executing at random diatonic and chromatic scales and the trills of the nightingale. It was also that profound and touching simplicity and the justness of accent which caused a thrill to pass through the audience with those simple notes of the middle voice, Je suis Ophélie. And when at length the echoes of the lake wafted to us the last high note of the poor young creature, an immense acclamation saluted in Madame Melba the most delicious Ophélie that has been heard since the days of Christine Nielsen and of Fides de Vries. She was recalled 3 times after the fall of the curtain, and, as statisticians, we have calculated that 3 recalls like those in the opera at Paris are quite equivalent to 75 recalls in Italy at the very least. We might explain this evening, parodying 2 lines of Voltaire, each people in its turn has reigned upon the scene, Australia's hour has come, as ours has been. Part of the usual contribution from a gentleman of the orchestra, which always follows the formal critique in the Figaro, was as appended. I would rather tell you at once that this debut was a triumph. No subscriber to the opera since the days of Nielsen remembers to have seen the curtain raised 3 times after the mad scene, not by the MOTD order of a splendidly trained claque, but in response to the unanimous demand of the entire audience moved to its inmost fibers and quivering with emotion. Before conquering her public as an artist, Madame Melba had, from her first appearance, vanquished them as a woman. In fact, an admirable harmony subsists between the two. In that tall and handsome person, the look of profound trouble, the physiognomy so remarkably mobile, seem made to express dramatic passion. There breathes from her that perfume of romance without which there can be no true Ophelia, and that aristocratic grace which befits the fiancée of a king's son. Tall, distinguished, beautiful. The purity, the flexibility, the precision, and caressing sweetness of her voice are marvelous, was the verdict of Monsieur Johannes Weber in Le Temps. Here and there, trivial critical reservations were made as to her foreign accent and other points in the interpretation, but the general verdict, as voiced by Messrs. Vitu, Johannes Weber, Victor Roger, Pierre Véron, Henri de la Pommeraye, Charles Leroy, Victor Wilder, Louis Besson, George Launay, Léon Kirst, H. Izoard, and the other critics, and emphatically endorsed by an applauding public, was one of eulogy. The Idol of Brussels, by a single performance, was already well advanced towards a similar popularity in Paris, where she was acclaimed as uniting a voice of celestial purity to the grace of Ophélie and the art of Malibran. In the audience on the night of her Paris debut were a few Australians, including her two sisters, who in response to a cable had come from Melbourne for the occasion, and who were deeply moved by the success which Melba achieved. Speaking of it next day, she said, "I am intensely happy. It was delightful." After the fourth act I was recalled 3 times, a compliment which they say has not been paid to any singer at the Grand Opera for over 30 years. My very first debut in Paris was at a charity concert in the Salle Erard 2 years ago, given under the patronage of Gounod, by the pupils of Madame Mathilde Marchesi, who, by the way, taught me 10 roles in less than a year. She it was who got me my first operatic engagement, and in every way she has been more than kind. I think that charity appearance was a real luck-bringer for me. It was there that Monsieur Lapicida and Monsieur Dupont, the directors of the Brussels Opera, heard me, and decided on my engagement. They offered me 3,000 francs a month, which I considered almost extravagant, and I do not think any money will ever give me such pleasure. Here in Paris the directors hesitated to fix on 4,000 francs, £160, a month for my contract until after my debut. So much the better for me, as now they are giving me 6,000 francs. Madrid and Berlin have offered me higher terms, much higher terms, and today the manager of the Gaieté, inspired by the success of my appearance last night, has also volunteered a better contract, but money is not everything, so I shall stay on at the opera. When I sang here 2 years ago as a Marchesi pupil at the charity concert, 2 or 3 of the critics who heard me then were very kind. An unkind criticism makes me unhappy, but today I have no reason to be depressed. All the critics are good to me, some very good. 1 or 2 are a little disappointed that I am a foreigner, and an Australian at that. However, I am proud of it, and I know the Parisians will excuse my having been born away from their beloved France. This beautiful bouquet was sent to me by the Australians in Paris, and gave me more pleasure than all the rest put together. I want always to associate any success I may have with the place where I was born, Melbourne, and that is why I have called myself Melba. The general cordiality of the French critics, which increased with each successive appearance, made Melba ponder further on the apathy of the connoisseurs of her own race, but individual assurances of appreciation continued to come from London, and, while wavering as to the future, she was fortunate enough to receive a most kind and gracious expression of opinion from some distinguished music lovers, which resulted in a speedy decision to try another season in London. On taking up her residence in Paris prior to her appearance at the opera, it was represented to Melba that her artistic advance would be blocked unless she took dramatic lessons from a certain teacher whose influence was considered paramount. No one had ever been able to make headway independent of this professor, she was told. "That may be," said Melba, "but I will not be coerced. I shall take my lessons from whom I like, when I like, and how I like, and I will also take the consequences," which she did, and these consequences proved that young students are too often tyrannized over by interested hirelings who flourish on misrepresentations of this kind, and whose very existence depends on the vicious conditions which the timidity of their too easy dupes maintain. Happily, from the very outset Melba showed clear confidence in her ability to succeed, and a complete independence of those considerations of money and influence to which so many students needlessly make sacrifice. Page 47, Chapter 8. Combien je garderai bon souvenir, chère madame, de ce joli matin de mai, oil je vous attendais dans votre petit salon, la fenêtre ouverte, en écoutant les oiseaux chanter dans les grands arbres du jardin. Vous êtes arrivé et vous avez chanté, et les petits oiseaux y sont tous, furieux de la concurrence et charmes par votre voix. Comte de Fontenelles. For her reappearance at Covent Garden on June 6, 1889, Melba selected the opera Rigoletto, in which Monsieur Lassalle impersonated the jester for the first time in England. The audience for the occasion was of very limited proportions, for which a violent thunderstorm may have been to some extent responsible. Her next performance was as Juliet in Gounod's opera Romeo and Juliet, given on June 15 for the first time in the French language, an innovation which was largely helped by Melba's readiness and enthusiasm, of which Augustus Harris made grateful acknowledgment. Monsieur Jean de Resca was the Romeo of the occasion, and Monsieur Edouard de Resca the friar, with Signor Mancinelli as conductor, and the London revival under the new linguistic conditions was an instantaneous success. In casting Melba for Juliet, Augustus Harris was largely influenced by the success with which she had performed the role in Brussels during the preceding season, and his emphatic expression of confidence in her ability to charm London in this character was abundantly justified by results. Throughout the evening her singing, acting, and appearance elicited the warmest admiration. At every opportunity she was rewarded with vehement enthusiasm, especially after the waltz air Je veux vivre, which she gave with an exquisite lightness and vocal purity that could hardly have been equaled. The audience were entirely captivated by the new Juliet, and the unrivaled beauty of her voice and the perfection of her vocalization were next day acknowledged in all the newspapers. With regard to her preceding performance as Gilda, the Standard wrote, "Madame Melba seems absolutely incapable of a false intonation, and is almost unsurpassed in the purity and sweetness of her tones. Her shake is close and even. The few embellishments she introduces are almost invariably in good taste, and in all she does sincerity and dramatic force are conspicuous. That Caro Nome could ever have been better sung than last night is difficult to believe. None but the warmest terms of admiration can do justice to the performance." The criticisms of Romeo and Juliet were in the same vein, and their eulogy had a special significance in view of the fact that she was closely following Madame Adelina Patti, whose great name threw a certain glamour around every musical undertaking with which she was identified. Melba as Juliet. Melba's position was enormously advanced by the Romeo and Juliet performance, and the recognition which she at one time had despaired of winning from the critics of London was now undoubtedly hers. By command of Queen Victoria, a state concert was arranged at Buckingham Palace on June 28, and Melba was summoned to take part, but at the last moment was unable to sing owing to a bad cold. A gala performance was announced for July 2 at Covent Garden, in honor of the Shah of Persia and His Majesty King Edward, then Prince of Wales, made known his wish that Melba should sing the Je veux vivre before the royal party. She was also on the program for the mad scene from Lucia de Lammermoor, which was conducted by Senior Randegger. The charm of her appearance and the elegance of her manner, enhanced by her operatic success, made a strong demand for social favor, and in the salons of the most exclusive hostesses she quickly became a persona grata. During a performance of Faust this season, 1889, Melba's pluck averted a serious accident at Covent Garden. It was in the first act, before Marguerite's real entry, so that she had no special call to be present at all. One of the wings in the study scene caught fire, and a sheet of flame was clearly visible to the whole audience. Before the threatened panic had time to develop, Melba stepped out and said a few words, which completely reassured those who were beginning to get frightened. The fire was put out, and the opera went on all right, but it was Melba's cool resourcefulness that had saved the situation. The opera season closed with Romeo and Juliet on July 27, specially interesting as the wedding day of the Duke and Duchess of Fife. A large number of royalties, including the Prince and Princess of Wales, the King of the Hellenes, the Grand Duke of Hesse, and the Crown Prince of Denmark, attended the performance, all wearing the festal favors of that afternoon's ceremony. At the close of the opera, in addition to the national anthem, the orchestra played Mendelssohn's Wedding March. Melba's bedroom, showing Marie Antoinette bed the same year Melba returned to Paris under the new contract with the opera directors, which allowed her certain privileges as to foreign appearances during the course of the Parisian season. She established her headquarters in a beautiful apartment at 9 Rue de Prony, near the Père Monceau, where her little son, who was at school in England, came to spend the holidays with his mother, and where she received many of the great people who illumined the art life of the city. The street on which her apartment looked out led directly to the Boulevard Malherbe, wherein was the residence of Gounod, whose friendship largely influenced the trend of her career. Sarah Bernhardt and Mathilde Marchesi were comparatively near neighbors, and Ardit Padilla lived but a few doors away. In the appointments of her new home, Melba followed the styles peculiar to the period of Marie Antoinette and Josephine. Accustomed to refined surroundings from her birth, and with excellent taste in household decoration, nothing was chosen because of its cost, and the whole atmosphere of the place was one of good taste and desirable solidity. During her residence at Brussels, Melba had made frequent trips to Paris to avail herself of the guidance of Gounod in the study of his operas Faust and Romeo and Juliet, and now that she had become a neighbor, she was a frequent visitor at his home. He minutely explained to her the difference between the characters of Marguerite and Juliet, dwelling especially on the simplicity of the poor peasant girl, who at first was too unsophisticated to understand, and later too timid to admit, her ready adoration of Faust. Juliet, he pointed out, was entirely different, and to the daughter of the Capulets he attributed unblushing forwardness. Juliet était un affronti, he often repeated, and, according to his reading, Mademoiselle Capulet deliberately set herself the task of storming the citadel of young Montague's heart. During these invaluable lessons Gounod always wore the little velvet cap with which his photographs have made the public familiar, and, in order to give Melba a clearer idea of his meaning, he would in turn sing all the parts. Thus, in his explanation of Romeo and Juliet to his favorite, he would in succession be Romeo, Juliet, Capulet, the friar, and the nurse. On one of these occasions, in humming over the passage, Caresse d'essa place etienne dans pas, de quelque disgrace fate elle vous tout bas, the composer, who, despite his advanced years, was always ready to make a joke, whispered at rehearsal in Melba's ear, with a smile, "So vous late dire tu ils avant de corps au pied." He took the keenest interest in everything she did at the rehearsals, and on the evenings of the performances he would sit in the director's box and watch and listen intently. When she particularly pleased him by any phrase or scene, he would subsequently reward her with a smile and embrace. Speaking of this time, Melba says, "I thank God for having met and known Gounod. He awakened in me my artistic sense. He was so broad, so human, and had so much to give." As for Gounod, he was unreserved in his praise of Melba's interpretation. He assured her and his friends that she brought to the work all the qualities he had imagined for his heroine, and on a photograph which he gave her at the time he wrote, "To the dear Juliet for whom I hoped, to Nellie Melba, H. Gounod." In the study of Faust, Melba further had the inestimable advantage of being assisted by Sarah Bernhard, who took infinite trouble in preparing the young singer for the adequate realization of the dramatic side of the character, and who has since had the gratification of seeing Melba's interpretation of Marguerite accepted as a performance of striking beauty and sincerity. The great French tragedienne, after explaining and suggesting the possibilities of the part, was always careful to add, "You must not imitate me. Do it your own way. You must be natural. Be yourself." Those who are familiar with Melba's acting, especially in Faust, Romeo and Juliet, Ida, Traviata, and La Bohème, can realize to what excellent use she put the coaching so kindly given her by her distinguished mentor. One of her great gratifications of this period was the receipt of the silver medal of the Paris Conservatoire. During the season she availed herself of the privilege extended to her by the directors of the opera, and early in 1890 accepted an engagement for 4 performances at Monte Carlo, the terms being much in advance of any remuneration hitherto given her. Page 53. Chapter 9. À la plus charmante femme, à la plus delicious artiste, à la voix de per cristal, la plus vive sympathy. Sarah Bernhard. It will be seen that even before she was entirely accepted as a popular prima donna, Melba had become a welcome figure in society, and the manner in which she has always kept up her social duties is one of the most surprising points in her career. She had never allowed herself to be exploited socially because of her professional celebrity. In the fashionable world she fills her place independent of her art, and the hospitality she receives she returns on a scale of corresponding elegance. As it is in London now, so it was in Paris during the number of years she made her home there. In the happy enjoyment of the honors which the French people continued to heap upon her, Melba, by courtesy of the opera management, resumed her place at Covent Garden for the season of 1890, the opera of Romeo and Juliet being listed for her rentrée on June 3, owing to the extraordinary success she had made in it the year before. From every point of view the conception of Juliet was accepted as complete and satisfying, and the Times, writing of this particular performance, said, "Nothing finer is to be seen on the operatic stage than the impersonation of the lovers by Monsieur Jean de Resca and Madame Melba." So complete a union of vocal with dramatic power as exists in both artists is granted to few singers, and it may be imagined that the 3 beautiful duets which form the chief point of interest in the 2 parts were perfectly sung. A week later Madame Melba made an important step in her career by her first appearance as Elsa in Lohengrin, of which the Pall Mall Gazette tersely said, "She plays the part, sings the music, and looks the character to perfection." It is worth recording that, for this performance she had only 1 piano rehearsal, and none at all with the orchestra. Although in the previous year, and again on June 26 of this year, she had the compliment of being summoned to take part in state concerts at Buckingham Palace, and in the gala performance to the Shah of Persia, it was for the afternoon of July 4, 1890, that Melba first received the honor of a command from Queen Victoria to sing privately to Her Majesty, who was then in residence at Windsor Castle. Melba and her comrades, Messrs. Jean and Edouard de Resca and Lassalle, were received with the utmost graciousness by the aged sovereign, to whom she sang, among other things, Caro Nome and the waltz song from Romeo and Juliet. She and Monsieur Jean de Resca took part in the duet from Traviata, and when the Empress Frederick, who came in late, asked for extra numbers, it goes without saying that they were given con amore. When interviewed concerning the Windsor visit, Melba devoted most of her attention to the doings of the de Resques and Lassalle, and of Mancinelli, who had played their accompaniments. Replying to a question put to her at the Hotel Metropole, where she then had her headquarters, she said, "Well, of course, we were all rather nervous, but the Queen has such a gentle, pleasant manner, she puts one at ease without any ado, and was full of kindly compliment to us all." Mendelssohn was right in describing her as a connoisseur of good music, but, as you may naturally suppose, her sympathies lean rather more to the old Italian than the new school. We sang the whole of the last act of Faust, although, according to the programs published in the papers, only the trio was performed. Jean de Resca, whom the Queen described as the finest tenor since Mario, sang the Prelude, and the Empress Frederick, who was most kind and charming, said that one number made her long to hear the entire opera, Die Meistersinger, which was then being beautifully given at Covent Garden. From the Queen Melba received a pretty jeweled souvenir of the visit. "I do not have to trouble much about my voice," continued Melba on the same occasion. "On the contrary, I enjoy my life, and do not make myself a slave to my profession. Only the other day I was at an important luncheon where the host had the honor of entertaining the Prince of Wales, King Edward VII. All the afternoon I was talking and laughing, yet when a telegram came from Mr. Harris asking me to sing that night in Faust, as Jean de Resca was not well enough to appear in Le Prophète, I was quite ready. When I had seemed to hesitate for a moment, His Royal Highness said, 'Do sing, I shall be there.' I did, and, in spite of my earlier exertions, the performance went off well. The Prince has been extremely kind to me ever since I came to England. He is, indeed, the most tactful, clever, and courteous of men, always ready to grant a favor even to those who have no special claim on his consideration, and scrupulously exact in carrying out anything to which his word may even only appear to bind him. As for the Princess, she is simply delightful, so gracious and appreciative. How is it, I wonder, that, wherever one may see her, she is always the prettiest woman in sight?" Goring Thomas's Esmeralda, which was staged on July 1-2, was another Melba novelty for that season, and was given with a French text for the first time. For this occasion the composer made sundry alterations in his score, adding a whole scene, which, when all is said and done, did not add much to the dramatic force of the work, for it is a prison scene which cannot fail to remind all who hear it of the similar scene in Faust, and the more so since there is an invisible chorus of female voices behind the scenes. The soprano air at the beginning of the scene is of exquisite quality, and brought out the tender pathos of Melba's voice to perfection. The succeeding duet with Frollo, which she sang with Lassalle, is of less musical value, and has not the dramatic vigor that the situation requires. and air de cloches replaced Quasimodo's charming What Shall I Do for My Queen, and the denouement, originally a conventional happy ending, was given some plausibility by being made tragic. Facsimile greetings from Gounod and Goring Thomas Melba bestowed infinite pains on the words and music, which latter she considered charming, although catchy and hard to learn. Her reading of the part was clever, and her singing was, of course, one of the great charms of the performance, which was witnessed by the Prince and Princess of Wales, and which resulted in ardent calls for the composer. The musical world was given another chance to test her quality on July 21, when she made her first London appearance in the French version of Hamlet. The Daily Telegraph held that the result, both in virtue of musical and dramatic talent, ranked Madame Melba's awfully amongst the best, while the Times, though considering her dramatic impersonation inferior to Nilsson's, held it vocally to be one of Melba's best parts, the mad scene being a marvelous and brilliant display of delicate and perfect vocalization. There she incontestably proved her right to be regarded as one of the finest artists who have ever appeared at Covent Garden. Perfect vocal art and high dramatic intelligence were equally and happily blended in a climax which fairly took a somewhat cold house by storm. We have heard nothing like it since Nilsson sang the part. It saved the opera. Pall Mall Gazette. Further eclat was given to Melba's rapidly growing favor by her singing at Marlborough House on July 25 before the Prince and Princess of Wales. The season closed on July 28 with a performance of Carmen, in which Jean de Resca sang the role of Don José for the first time in England. It may be recorded here that Melba's advent at Covent Garden was most welcome to the staff of the theatre, who often chafed under the conditions of superficiality and affectation which leading singers, as a rule, had hitherto thought it desirable to uphold. Miss Alice Joseph, the concert agent, who during Melba's early years at Covent Garden was private secretary to Augustus Harris, said one day to a caller at his office, "Melba is a revelation to most of us. She is so reliable and so reasonable. The stage hands love her. She is simple and natural, neither shy nor bouncing." During her first season, many of the musical people said she was the coming star, but while she had sufficient confidence in herself, she never said so. I recall her exclaiming one day during that season that her great ambition was to sing with the de Resques. When the following years brought her the fame she desired, she never altered, but retained a fine combination of dignity and simplicity. Unlike the average artist, she had no superstitions when she came to us, and had even selected the 13th of the month for her operatic debut, but I think she cultivated a few in deference to the governor, for later on she refused to be photographed in any costume until after the public production. I remember on her birthday one season he handed her a packet of letters which had been addressed to the theatre. Many of them were messages of kind wishes, among them a card on which was a peacock's feather in bold design. As she was drawing it from the envelope, he caught sight of it and, with an expression of exaggerated horror, snatched it from her hand and tore it into little bits before she could even see from whom it came. "We can't have anything unlucky like that in the house," he explained to Melba, who was greatly surprised and amused. Page 59, Chapter 10 La prima donna incontestée de notre Académie nationale de musique, Paris. Emmanuel Bourget. Melba's only appearance at the Opéra Comique, Paris, Theatre des Nations, was on the occasion of the matinee performance of Carmen given on December 11, 1890, to raise funds for a statue to perpetuate the memory of the composer Bizet, whereat she established a precedent for great prima donnas by electing to sing the brief part of Michaela, which had hitherto been interpreted by artists of secondary importance. The title role on that day was sung by Madame Gauli-Marie, the original French exponent. The receipts of the matinee reached the exceptional sum of 42,000 francs. At Covent Garden, Melba subsequently volunteered to enact Michaela to the Carmen of Madame Emma Cave, the brilliant successor to Madame Gauli-Marie, and later on in America, when at the head of her own company, she yet again followed this commendable example by singing the minor character to the lead of Mademoiselle Zélie de Lussan. Modesty, reasonable self-effacement in the interests of art, and a willingness to share the glamour of her position with great or obscure colleagues, are qualities which Melba has always shown in such a degree as to excite the incredulity of those who are more familiar with the real or imaginary stories of violent professional jealousy. The death of Leo Delibes in Paris on January 16, 1891, was a sincere sorrow to Melba, who owed much to his kind interest. By the death of the Earl of Lytton that year another tie that had closely bound her to Paris since she first went there to study was broken. During Lord Lytton's term at the embassy he and his brilliant wife, whose interest permeated the whole British colony, had been warm friends to the young British singer, who on more than one trying occasion was supported by the sympathy and encouragement of Lady Lytton. In 1890 Melba received the unique honor of an imperial summons from the Tsar Alexander, desiring her to appear at the Imperial Opera, St. Petersburg, where, during February 1891, with Jean and Edouard de Resca, she took part in a series of brilliant productions, which included Lohengrin, Faust, and Romeo and Juliet. In accordance with the command of the Emperor, these operas were newly mounted with the greatest regard for the completeness of every detail, and extraordinary interest was manifested by the public. Melba's personal and artistic success was entirely beyond all ordinary measure, and the critics and the public generally exceeded the bounds of the most sanguine anticipations in the eulogy and attentions which they lavished upon her. Facsimile page by Rubinstein, who was at that time engaged at the Conservatoire, and in failing health, heard many stories of Melba's operatic triumphs, and he wrote to her saying that, as he was too ill to come and hear her, he hoped she would be kind to a feeble old musician, and come to him. Her immediate reply was that she would be honored to act on his suggestion, and at the earliest possible moment she made him a visit, and sang to him everything he wished to hear. Despite failing eyesight, he was able to play to most of her numbers, and this circumstance made the occasion one of particular interest for Melba, who found in the great pianist a really superb accompanist. The imperial family honored her with numerous evidences of their favor, and the souvenirs which she carried away from Russia included a turquoise and diamond bracelet from the Grand Duchess Paul, a diamond and sapphire bracelet from the Grand Duke Alexis, and an exquisite bracelet of uncommon design from His Majesty the Emperor Alexander. This latter ornament, which she always wears and regards as a mascot, is composed of engraved diamond cubes and large pearls strung together on a slender chain of platinum and gold. Although Melba possesses a famous collection of jewels, she does not value them much as a means of personal adornment, but from an artistic standpoint could be easily moved to enthusiasm by the beauty of their coloring, shape, or setting. Pearls are her favorite, and one of the finest in her possession is a wonderful solitaire ring presented to her by Herr von Mendelssohn, a kinsman of the great composer, at whose house she sang during a visit to Berlin. The Grand Duke Alexis gave in her honor a dinner at which the flowers and gold plate were magnificent. His Imperial Highness subsequently personally conducted Melba through the show apartments of the palace, and during the evening she sang for her imperial hosts. According to local authorities, no singer had ever so quickly captured the favor of the St. Petersburg public, and when she left on her return to Paris, she was made the recipient of an extravagant farewell ovation, one which the prima donna recalls to this day as among the most remarkable of her career. A chair had to be placed in the wings to enable her to rest between the recalls. On the night of her farewell performance, a large crowd assembled outside the stage door, and when she entered the carriage they heaped it so high with flowers that she was almost invisible amid the banks of blossoms. A band of music-loving youths belonging to the Russian aristocracy spread their coats on the snow-covered footpath for her to walk on, and indulged in all sorts of other complimentary excesses. She was surrounded by scores of admirers who had brought photographs, programs, and cards on which to beg her autograph. The borrowed pencil with which she made the signatures was eventually returned to the owner, who was compelled to break it and divide the pieces among importunate friends. The crowd still pressed close around her and struggled to shake hands, and eventually, in response to the calls of some enthusiasts, she took off her gloves and threw them to the claimants, who portioned the scraps among the youths who, like so many Raleighs, had spread their coats beneath her feet. Such was the manner of her departure from St. Petersburg. For medals, Melba's season in Russia added largely to her reputation, and when she returned to Paris to resume her place at the opera, her position was still more secure. If Brussels had a claim on her because it was in that city she made her first appearance in opera, Paris had come to explain that it had the prior claim, since it was the training and atmosphere of Paris that had given to the Brussels debut the possibilities of success. The critics had now no terms of reservation in their review of Melba's art. The establishment of her home in their midst gave unqualified satisfaction. She was cited as a typical Parisian, and amid the acclamation of the art world she again received the silver medal of the Paris Conservatoire. During a performance of Lucia one evening, the tenor, who had been ill, endeavored to go on with his part rather than disappoint the management, who had no deputy, but found himself voiceless during the great duet in the first act. In order to hide her colleague's unfortunate lapse and give the manager a little time to help the situation, Melba with great resourcefulness held the opera together by singing Edgardo's music as well as her own, and thus kept the scene going until the fall of the curtain. It happened, oddly enough, that Monsieur Engel, who had sung the part with Melba in Brussels, was among the audience, and his kindly volunteered services were gladly accepted for the completion of the opera. Madame Carnot, who was also of the audience that evening, was one of the first to notice Melba's efforts to help her comrade, and she was most enthusiastic in her appreciation of the prima donna's kindly presence of mind. Page 64, Chapter 11, The Incomparable Melba. Henry Irving. Before Melba had advanced far on her professional career, the illusions natural to a girlhood free from care had vanished one by one, and in repose her features already bore indefinable evidence that the thorns of poor human experience had pressed their sharpness through her rose-strewn path. The expression of sadness still lingers on her face, but through her cheerfulness and good fellowship she is mainly known to the world in general, and even to the majority of her friends, as a woman whose habitual vivacity provokes infectious gaiety. Reticent as to the sorrow which has been her portion, she is inversely demonstrative as to the joy which is her share, and loves to surround herself with those who despise the mean streets of existence and gamble in the sunny avenues of life. If Melba has always shown delightful readiness to appreciate the art of her operatic companions, it is also pleasant to note that the greatest among her fellows have been no less generous in their estimation of her personal and musical gifts. What more charming testimony than this, la nature vous a doué d'une voix d'or, positivement la plus belle de notre temps, vous êtes musician, vous êtes femme charmante. Tout ces qualités peuvent être appréciées par le public, mais ce que j'ai sais, moi, c'est que vous êtes la meilleure des camarades, et que j'ai garderai un éternel souvenir de nos relations artistiques et amicales. Comptez toujours sur votre devoir Jean de Resca. An operatic event of singular brilliance was the gala performance held at Covent Garden on July 8, 1891, by command of Queen Victoria, to celebrate the state visit of the German Emperor and Empress. The naval, military, and political clubs in Pall Mall, and other buildings along the route, were magnificently illuminated, and a guard of honor of the 1st Battalion of the Coldstreams was drawn up in front of the Opera House on the arrival of the Imperial and Royal Party. Every corner of the building was turned into a bower of flowers, and it was conceded that no performance had ever been surrounded with such circumstances of splendor. It was a matter of gratification to Madame Melba to receive Her Majesty's command for such an occasion, and it was in the role of Juliet that she appeared before the illustrious visitors. The royal circle included the Prince and Princess of Wales, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, the Duke of Clarence, the Duke of Cambridge, the Duke and Duchess of Fife, Princesses Victoria and Maud of Wales, the Duchess of Albany, Princess Henry of Battenberg, and the Duchess of Teck. One night, during the last act of Romeo and Juliet, the extra curls which Melba had pinned on to supplement her own hair became unfastened and fell on the stage. Jean de Resca lessened the embarrassment of the occasion by hiding the errant tresses under his feet and kicking them aside at an opportune moment. A few days later, when the incident was the subject of a bantering conversation at Lady de Grey's, the Princess of Wales, Queen Alexandra, said, with an amused smile, to Melba, and they were such nice curls, too. On another occasion, when the curtain was still down on the tomb scene, Jean de Resca went on the stage to speak to Melba. While so engaged, the curtain was rung up, and awkwardly disclosed his premature presence in the tomb. Not for an instant did he betray the confusion of the situation. With perfect resourcefulness he altered the text so easily and so effectively that few among the audience could realize that there had been any untoward development in the action of the opera. From the opening to the close of the Covent Garden season she sang with all her wonted brilliancy, and when she left for her home in Paris was seen off by a largely augmented gathering of friends. The routine of Melba's professional life was pleasantly varied in the spring of 1892, when she won first prize for the most beautifully decorated car in the Battle of Flowers at Nice. Her artistic taste and original ideas were well illustrated in the coloring and design of the ornamental scheme, and along the carnival course the gay equipage was greeted with acclamation. The Prince and Princess of Monaco, who had honored her with many attentions, were among the first to offer their congratulations on her carnival victory, which was especially popular among the English and French visitors then on the Riviera. The same evening she sang Lucia at the opera, and there was an added warmth in the welcome tendered her. Like the majority of Australians, Melba loves horses, and expresses the opinion that if she were a man she would endeavor to excel at polo. Although a great believer in open-air life, she has, nevertheless, never taken any considerable part in outdoor games. Page 68. Chapter 12 Imagines un voix delicious, d'un timbre per comme le cristal, venant s'y poser sur les lèvres de la cantatrice, avec la délicatesse aérienne d'un oiseau, et la essigrenant en trillis et en vocalizes, sans que la fait que les tumeurs les pearls de sa bouche trahissent le moindre effort ou la jean la plus légère. Victor Wilder. Melba appeared in Sicily, in Traviata, at Palermo, during the spring of 1892, of which she retains an uncommon souvenir in the shape of a solid gold visiting card, bearing her name and an inscribed message from her impresario, who chose this way of keeping in her mind her initial professional experience in the historic island. Incidental to the engagement, there was nothing of a peculiarly noteworthy character, but Melba had some interesting personal experiences. Always a bad sailor, she was unlucky enough to have a very disagreeable water journey from Naples to Palermo, and arriving at her hotel about 5 o'clock in the morning, feeling very tired, she at once went to bed, but was soon aroused from her sleep by the occupant of the next room, who played through several times the cello part of Braga's Serenata. Always alert for music, she speedily aroused herself, and almost involuntarily sang the vocal part to the cellist's further repetition of the well-known air. At the close her neighbor in the next room called out, "You sang that very well. Who are you?" The singer answered, "I am Nelly Melba." "Who are you?" Braga, was the response, and in this curious fashion came about her meeting with the Italian musician. During this season she also sang at the Argentine Theatre, Rome, in the opera of Lucia di Lammermoor. Melba as Violetta in Traviata facsimile page by Gaetano Braga. Owing to her many engagements in other countries, Melba's house in Paris was at this time little more than a pied-à-terre for her, but she always made a point of being there during the holidays of her little son, who was at school in England, and whose homecomings were the brightest light in these days of ever-growing brilliancy. Every detail that could add to his well-being and increase his none too abundant physical vigor was the mother's constant care. No matter what the storm or stress of her professional life, no want of the little lad was too trifling for her attention. Pictures of the boy in every pose accompanied her on all her expeditions, and the fortune that had come so readily to her was doubly prized because of all it would mean in the future to her idolized only child. Among the then circle of Melba's friends in Paris was Madame Bemberg, who had been a brilliant singer contemporary with Alboni, and for whose son, Hermann, Gounod stood sponsor. Monsieur Bemberg early gave promise of unusual musical understanding, and the development of his artistic gifts was greatly encouraged by the Australian singer. Before the completion of his opera Elaine, she sang over some of the music to him on different occasions, an experience which aroused him to the following expression of appreciation: "Que plains ce que n'ont pas eu la joie delicious d'être chanté par elle. Je n'aime souvenirs pas d'une emotion plus intense que celle que j'éprouve en entendant supérieur de cette adorable voix ces premières mesures de l'air d'Elaine. J'ai cru rêver, et j'étais evil. Puis la réalité n'est pas un voleur comme un rêve et me donner l'incomparable bonheur de voir créer Elaine par l'artiste que j'ai met au-dessus des touts, Nelly Melba. J. Bemberg. The opera was dedicated to Melba and Jean d'Aresca, who created the two leading roles on its production at Covent Garden on July 5. Melba entered into all the preliminaries with unusual zest. Jean d'Aresca was equally enthusiastic, and the young composer was naturally envied and complimented on the good fortune that gave his work such distinguished exponents as these two singers and Marie Brima, Mathilde Bauermeister, Edouard de Resca, and Paul Plankin. Melba and Jean de Resca were repeatedly recalled after each act, and at the close of the death scene in the last act Melba had to come 5 times before the curtain, while the composer himself received 2 calls. Monsieur Bemberg enjoys life more than most people, and is generally bubbling over with gaiety, which finds constant vent in his capacity for outlandish practical jokes. On the day of his first visit to Melba he took with him so magnificent an offering of flowers, and looked so very joyous, that her butler declined to admit the unfamiliar visitor. Bemberg, however, was determined, and eventually the butler announced him. Before entering the salon he held the elaborate bouquet well forward, and asked, "May I come?" In a few minutes Melba and he were talking and laughing like old friends. His merriment was irresistible, and he was invited to stay to lunch. With the afternoon came other visitors, but Monsieur Bemberg's power to amuse his hostess and her friends never flagged, and it was only after dinner that he took his leave, the duration of his first call being a point which Melba is fond of telling against him. Melba as Elaine Bemberg's opera was the only novelty with which she was associated that season, but her success in everything she sang was undeniable, and before the close of the summer term she was obliged to appear in 2 special extra performances of Faust and Lohengrin. Romeo and Juliet was also given with great success, Melba's role, always vocally perfect, being now histrionically exquisitely poetical. After a rest at Aix during the month of August, followed by continental engagements, Melba had her initial experience of an autumn season at Covent Garden, in which one of her important undertakings was her first appearance as Ida, of which the Daily Telegraph said, "It is needless to say she sang well, for that she always does, but the feeling she threw into her work, feeling which sometimes reached abandonment to the passion of the minute, was a revelation of power not generally suspected." Both her singing and acting in the scene, which ends with the arrest of Radames, were fully equal to the demands of the music and the situation. By this time her improved work in Lohengrin had come to be the special delight of her admirers, and when she appeared in that opera during the supplementary season, the Times was able to say, "Madame Melba's reading of the part of Elsa is, of course, well known, and nothing that is not praise can be said of it, but a special word of praise must be given for her superb singing in the second act." On November 23, 1892, she appeared as Desdemona in Verdi's Otello, and while the earlier numbers won a new beauty from the girlish freshness of the voice, which makes her an ideal Juliet, the songs in the last act were made infinitely pathetic, even though the impersonation was not then among her dramatic successes. As she had had only 4 days' study of the part, it is not surprising that certain points were missed, or that her usually trustworthy memory should have failed her for a few bars in the ensemble of the third act. She took a conspicuous share in the celebration of the professional jubilee of the famous Alboni. Numbers of distinguished men and women joined in felicitations to this great singer, who during so many seasons had enjoyed immense popularity in England, and the young Australian travelled from London to Paris specially in order to pay tribute to the veteran, who subsequently wrote, Paris, December, 1892. À Madame Melba. Je suis passé chez vous, ma chère Madame Melba, pour vous remercier d'avoir été si gracieusement aimable à l'occasion de mes noces d'or artistiques. Cela ne me suffit pas, je tiens beaucoup à vous l'écrire, non seulement pour vous remercier, mais encore pour vous dire que vous avez été admirable comme chanteuse à roulade, et comme chanteuse dramatique. J'ai été parfaitement heureuse, ma chère Madame Melba, de vous entendre, et j'ai tiens beaucoup aussi que vous le saturez. J'embrasse votre jolie figure. Votre affectionné ex-contralto, Marie Ziegler Alboni. Page 73, Chapter 13 Il vostro canto e una ineffable carezza. Gaetano Braga. In 1893 Melba made a serious bid for the favor of the Italian public, and on March 16 of that year she sang at La Scala, Milan, for the first time, under conditions